Wyatt Callahan slammed a crumpled 20 bill onto the saloon counter so hard the whiskey glasses rattled. Every man in that room went silent. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't explain himself. He just stood there, shoulders wide, jaw locked, eyes burning, and said 2 words to the man holding the woman's arm. "Let go." Nobody moved. Then Caleb Mercer laughed. Because the woman Wyatt had just bought her freedom for was someone every single man in Raven Creek had already decided wasn't worth saving. If this story already has your heart pounding, you are exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button right now and follow this channel, because I promise you what happens next between this mountain man and this woman is going to wreck you in the most beautiful way possible. Drop your city in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because part 1 starts right here. The night Wyatt Callahan walked into the Lucky Strike saloon. He had no intention of staying longer than it took to buy a bottle of whiskey and get back on his horse. He was not a man who liked crowds. He was not a man who liked noise. And he was absolutely not a man who liked Raven Creek a ragged, frostbitten excuse for a frontier town sitting at the base of the Bitterroot Mountains, like something the wilderness had coughed up and refused to take back. The kind of place where men came to gamble away what little they had left, and women came because they had nowhere else to go. Wyatt had ridden down from the mountains only because his supply run could not wait another week. He'd stretched the flour and salt and coffee as far as they would go. The cold had come early this year, and the trails up into the high country were already turning treacherous. He'd told himself he would be in town for 1 hour. Maybe less. He pushed through the saloon doors at 7:30. And the smell hit him first: unwashed men, cheap tobacco, spilled liquor, and the particular kind of desperation that clung to places like this the way smoke clung to wool. The piano player in the corner was banging out something badly off-key. A group of men near the back were playing cards and arguing about it. The bartender, a thick-necked man named Roy Stubbs, wiped the same glass in circles without ever actually cleaning it. Wyatt moved to the far end of the bar, kept his back to the wall the way a man learned to do when he'd spent enough years in rough country, and ordered his whiskey. He was almost done with it when the doors slammed open. Caleb Mercer came in, dragging a woman behind him by the wrist. Wyatt didn't know the man's name yet. He only knew the type. Mid-30s, the kind of lean that came not from hard work, but from long stretches of not eating, followed by long stretches of drinking. Hat pushed back on his head at an angle that suggested he thought it looked confident. Eyes too bright, too restless, jumping around the room looking for something to land on. The woman stumbled as he pulled her forward, her boot catching on the uneven floorboards. And she grabbed the doorframe with her free hand to keep from going down. He didn't slow down, didn't even glance back at her. "Listen up," Caleb announced, loud enough to cut through the piano and the card arguments both. "I got something to sell." The room shifted, not toward him exactly, more like the attention in the room tilted in his direction. The way water tilts in a bucket when you move it. Men looked up from their drinks. The card game paused. Wyatt didn't move. He kept his whiskey in his hand and watched. The woman Caleb had dragged in was not what any of the men in that room had been expecting. Judging by the sound, they made a kind of collective snort. Part surprise, part cruelty. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with dark hair that had come loose from whatever she'd pinned it up with and was falling in damp strands around her face. She was wearing a faded brown dress that had seen too many washes and not enough mending. Her boots were cracked. Her coat was too thin for the temperature outside. She was a full-figured woman, the kind the world called too much of everything, too big, too soft, too much space taken up. The other men in that room saw that in about 2 seconds flat and made their assessment just as fast. "What you gonna do with her, Caleb?" one of the card players called out. And several men laughed. Caleb didn't flinch. "She's got a labor contract, legal and signed. I'm selling that contract tonight because I need cash to settle a debt before morning. And she's the only asset I've got. More laughter from the crowd. Someone said something Wyatt couldn't quite catch. But whatever it was made the men near him cackle. The woman Wyatt watched her face. She didn't look down. That surprised him. He'd expected her to shrink. To fold into herself the way people did when they were used to being made small. But she didn't. Her chin stayed level. Her eyes moved around the room. Steady and dark, and taking everything in, and there was something in her expression that he could not immediately name. Not anger, not fear exactly, something older than both of those things. Something that looked like a person who had already decided the world was going to be exactly as terrible as she had always known it was, and had made her peace with it. That was the thing that kept him from finishing his drink and walking out. Not the situation, not the injustice of it, though God knows there was injustice enough. It was the look in her eyes that said she was not even surprised. $20, Caleb said. $20 and she's yours. Full labor contract, legally binding, and she knows how to cook, clean, and keep a house. Roy Stubbs leaned on the bar. For her, the laughing got louder. One man near the window stood up halfway out of his chair, made a show of looking her over, and sat back down. I wouldn't pay $2, he said, and his friends slapped the table. Caleb's face went tight. He needed that money. Wyatt could see it in the way the man's hand tightened on the woman's wrist. She's a hard worker, Caleb said, less confident now. The edges of his voice starting to show the panic underneath. She's strong. She don't complain. She ain't exactly what a man's looking for, somebody said from the back. And the room agreed with him, without anyone having to say another word. The woman's jaw tightened. That was the only sign. That small tightening, like she was biting down on something she'd been biting down on for so long her teeth ached with it. Wyatt set his glass down. He told himself not to do it. He told himself he had flour to buy and a mountain to get back to before the trail iced over, and that whatever was happening in this saloon was none of his concern, and that a man who got himself tangled in other people's trouble in a place like Raven Creek was a man who ended up with more trouble than he started with. He told himself all of that. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded, crumpled 20 bill and put it on the bar. The room went quiet. Roy Stubbs stared at it. Caleb Mercer stared at it. The card player stared at it. Wyatt looked at Caleb. I'll take the contract. Caleb blinked. He hadn't expected it from this particular direction. Nobody had. Wyatt was not a man anyone in this room knew well. He came down from the mountains rarely enough that he was more rumor than person. Big, quiet, dressed in worn leather and heavy wool, with a beard that had gone weeks without any attention and eyes that didn't give away much of anything. Not the kind of man you expected to do something like this. You sure? Caleb said, and there was something almost apologetic in his voice, like he was giving Wyatt a chance to reconsider before he embarrassed himself. Wyatt's voice was flat, not angry. Just certain. Caleb looked at the woman, then at the money. He dropped her wrist, snatched the bill off the bar, and shoved a folded piece of paper across the counter. Contract's there. She's yours, mister. The room stayed quiet for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then the piano player started back up badly, and the card game resumed. And the men who had been laughing went back to their drinks. And just like that, it was over. The whole thing had taken less than 3 minutes. Wyatt picked up the paper and put it in his coat pocket without reading it. He looked at the woman. She was looking at him, not with gratitude, not with fear, with that same steady, assessing look she'd been using on the whole room, except now it was aimed at him alone, and it was sharper than he expected. You got a coat, he said. She blinked. Whatever she'd been expecting him to say. It wasn't that. I've got what I'm wearing, she said. Her voice was low and a little rough, like someone who hadn't had much cause to use it recently. He looked at Roy Stubbs. "You got a coat back there worth selling?" Roy reached under the bar and produced a heavy wool thing that'd seen better years but still had warmth left in it. Wyatt bought it without negotiating and pushed it across the bar toward the woman. She didn't take it right away. "Go ahead," he said. She picked it up slowly, like she was waiting for the catch. She put it on. It was too big for her, the sleeves coming down past her wrists. But she pulled it around herself, and something in her face changed so slightly that if Wyatt hadn't been watching closely, he would have missed it entirely. "I'm Rosalie," she said. "Rosalie Bennett, Wyatt Callahan," he nodded toward the door. "My horse is outside. We're gonna lose the trail if we wait much longer." She walked out of the Lucky Strike ahead of him. And not a single man in that saloon said anything to either of them as they left. Outside, the cold hit like a wall. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since Wyatt had come inside. And the wind was picking up off the mountains, the kind of cutting edge to it that meant weather was coming. He untied his horse from the post, a big gray animal, solid and patient, and turned to see Rosalie standing a few feet away, watching him. "Where are we going?" she asked. "My cabin. Up in the mountains. Few hours. Might be more, with 2 on the horse and weather coming in." She looked at the mountains. There wasn't much to see in the dark, just the black shapes of the peaks against a slightly less black sky. But she looked at them for a long moment anyway. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Why did you do that?" He swung up into the saddle. "Do what?" "You know what." He reached a hand down toward her. "Come on, we need to move." She looked at his hand. Then she took it, and he helped her up behind him. And they rode north out of Raven Creek without another word between them. The trail up into the Bitterroots was not made for 2 people on 1 horse in the dark. But Wyatt knew every foot of it the way a man knows a path he's walked 1,000 times, not by thinking about it but by feel. By the particular rhythm of the ground under the horse's hooves. By the sound of the trees. He kept the pace slow and steady. Rosalie sat behind him without complaint. She didn't grab at him the way some people did when they were nervous on horseback. She balanced herself, adjusted when the trail tilted. Moved with the horse. About an hour in, she said, "You didn't buy the flour." He glanced back. "What?" "You came into town for supplies. You had a list in your coat pocket. I saw you check it when you walked in. You left without buying anything except me and a coat." He turned back to the trail. "I'll come back down. You could have just bought your supplies and left." "Could have." The wind shifted. And somewhere above them in the trees, something moved, probably just a branch. Probably just the weight of ice, but the horse's ears went forward and Wyatt steadied him with his knees. Rosalie said, quietly, mostly to herself it seemed. "Nobody does something for nothing." Wyatt didn't answer that. She didn't press him. They rode in silence for a while. The cold was deep and serious now, the kind that found gaps in clothing and settled into them. But Rosalie didn't say anything about it. He could feel her shivering behind him. Small controlled tremors she was clearly trying to suppress. But she made no sound. He stopped the horse. "What's wrong?" she said immediately. "Nothing." He shrugged off his outer coat, a heavy canvas thing lined with sheepskin, and held it back toward her. "Put this on over the other one." A long pause. "Then you'll freeze." "I've got wool underneath. I run warm." Another pause, shorter this time. She took the coat. She didn't thank him. He noticed that. Not because it bothered him, it didn't, but because it was the first time he'd offered something to someone in a very long time. And the absence of the expected response made him aware of the offer in a way he hadn't been before. They kept moving. By the time the cabin came into sight, a low, dark shape against the darker tree line, the faintest thread of smoke still drifting from the chimney, because they'd banked the fire before leaving. Hands were cold enough that he fumbled with the horse's lead rope. Rosalie slid down first and took the rope from him without being asked. "I'll tie him. You get the fire going." He looked at her. "I can tie a horse," she said, with a tone that suggested this was not the first time she'd had to point that out. He went inside and built the fire back up. By the time Rosalie came through the door a few minutes later, the cabin was warming. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in the single large room, the rough-hewn furniture, the shelves of supplies along the far wall, the two windows with their heavy shutters already closed against the cold. It was not a comfortable place by most people's standards. It was functional, it was clean, it was insistently, almost aggressively, a space built for one person and one person only. "You can sleep there." He pointed to the bed in the corner. "I'll take the floor." She turned and looked at him. "It's your bed, and I'm offering it to you, Mr. Callahan Wyatt." A beat. "Wyatt." She said the name carefully, like she was testing the weight of it. "You don't have to do this. I'm aware of that." She stopped. Started again. "I know what a labor contract means. I know what I'm supposed to do to earn my keep. I've had this conversation before. In other places, with other men. You can just tell me what you want." The fire popped and sent up a spray of sparks. Wyatt looked at her steadily. "I want you to sleep," he said. "Because you look like you haven't done it properly in a week. And I don't need anything from you tonight." Her expression didn't change. But her hands, which had been absolutely still at her sides, the kind of stillness that was not relaxation but control. Deliberate control, the stillness of someone braced for impact, her hands moved. Just slightly. The fingers loosened. "There's food on the shelf," Wyatt said. "Beans and salt pork. Help yourself." He lay down on the floor by the fire with his bedroll and closed his eyes. After a long moment he heard her moving, the soft sound of her boots on the floor, the gentle clink of the pot, the scrape of the iron spoon. She cooked quietly and ate standing up, and when she was done, she washed the pot without being asked and set it back exactly where she'd found it. Then she lay down on the bed and was asleep inside of 3 minutes. Wyatt lay in the dark listening to the wind work at the shutters and the fire settle into its lower burn. And he thought about none of the things he usually lay awake thinking about. He thought instead about the look on Rosalie Bennett's face in that saloon. The way she hadn't looked away, the way her hands had loosened by the fire. He did not examine what he felt about any of it. He just let it sit there. The way you let something sit when you don't quite know what it is yet. The next morning, Rosalie was up before him. He woke to the smell of coffee, real coffee. Not the weak excuse he usually made himself, and the sound of something being done efficiently in his kitchen. He sat up and found her at the stove, her hair pinned back up, the borrowed coat hanging on the hook by the door, wearing her faded dress with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, moving through his kitchen, the way a person moved through a space they'd decided to understand. She had found the coffee. She had found the pan and the cornmeal, and the side of bacon he'd cured himself back in September. She had produced from these materials an actual breakfast. Wyatt sat at his table and drank his coffee and ate his food. And Rosalie sat across from him and did the same, and neither of them said much until they were nearly done. Then she said, "Your horse has a stone bruise on his left front foot. You'd have had trouble on that trail in another week." He set his cup down. "When did you notice that?" "Last night when I tied him." She looked at her plate. "I cleaned it out and packed it. He should be all right in a few days if you keep him rested." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. "You know horses." "I know a lot of things," she said. There was no pride in it, just a statement of fact. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. "Before Mercer." Her expression closed slightly, not dramatically. Not rudely, just the way a door eases shut when the wind is blowing the wrong direction. "Lot of places," she said. "Before Mercer there was a family outside Missoula. Before them there was a boarding house in Helena. Before that," she stopped. "It doesn't much matter. All right," she looked up, apparently surprised that he'd left it there. He pushed back from the table. "I'm going to check the traps on the North Ridge. There's more bacon and flour if you're hungry later. You don't have to, he paused. You don't have any obligations here. Not the kind you're thinking. You can do as you like. She watched him pull on his coat. Wyatt, she asked. Just that. Just the one word. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, because you looked like someone who'd stopped expecting anything. And I couldn't stand to see it. He went out before she could respond. Over the next several days, a rhythm developed between them that neither of them planned and neither of them acknowledged. Rosalie cooked, because she was better at it than he was, and they both knew it. She tended the horse with a careful expertise that impressed him more each time he watched her. She found small repairs around the cabin, a shutter hinge that had been sticking for 2 years, a gap in the chinking near the north wall that let in a cold draft, a leg on the workbench that wobbled, and she fixed them. Not because he asked, but because she saw they needed doing. Wyatt brought in wood and checked the trap lines and did the 100 heavy tasks that the mountain demanded in winter. And in the evenings they sat on opposite sides of the fire, and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. And the silence between them stopped being uncomfortable sometime around the 4th day. He learned things about her gradually, the way you learn terrain piece by piece, following what the landscape offers rather than forcing a path. She had grown up in eastern Montana, on a small homestead that had failed the year she turned 12. Her parents had done their best. She spoke of them without bitterness. After they were gone, she'd relied on her own hands for nearly 15 years, moving from place to place, taking whatever work came available, cooking, cleaning, caring for livestock, helping with harvests. She was tireless and capable, and people hired her, and then, when they decided they didn't need her anymore, they let her go without ceremony and without much thought. She was 27 years old and had never been anywhere long enough to call it home. What she did not tell him, not in those first days, was the thing she carried with her. The thing that made the distance in her eyes when they were quiet. The thing that was behind every question she hadn't asked yet. He noticed it. He waited. On the 6th night, a storm came down off the peaks and locked them inside the cabin for the better part of 2 days. The wind hit the shutters hard enough to rattle them on their hinges. And the cold outside was the kind that killed if you were caught in it wrong. They stayed inside, close to the fire, and talked more than they had since she'd arrived. She told him about coming to Montana, about the series of decisions and circumstances that had eventually put her in Caleb Mercer's reach. She talked about it plainly, without asking for his sympathy. And he listened the same way plainly, without offering what she hadn't asked for. And then she went quiet for a while, and Wyatt let her. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was different. Lower, slower, like she was pulling the words up from somewhere deep. I had a brother, she said. The fire snapped. Wyatt said carefully. Have, she corrected herself quickly. Have Samuel. He's younger than me by 4 years. After our folks died, we stuck together for a while. She stopped. Tried again. He was the only person I ever knew who didn't look at me the way people look at me. Wyatt didn't ask her to explain that. We got separated, she said, 3 years ago near a mining settlement called Silver Ridge, over near the Eastern Range. He was working there. I was coming to find him, to bring him somewhere better. And when I got there, they told me he'd moved on, gone north. They didn't know where. She looked at the fire. I didn't believe them. Why not? Because Samuel wouldn't leave without getting word to me. That's not who he is. She reached into the pocket of her dress and brought out a small cloth bundle, the kind tied with a bit of string, and held it in both hands without opening it. He carved me this before I left to come find him. Said he'd make me another when I got there. She still didn't open the bundle. I've been carrying it for 3 years. Wyatt looked at the bundle in her hands. What is it? She untied the string and unfolded the cloth. and inside was a small wooden carving of a bird, a sparrow, or something like it. No bigger than the palm of her hand. Simple work, not elaborate. But careful. You could see the care in it. He always carved birds, she said. Said they were the only creatures that got to choose where they went. The wind threw itself against the cabin wall. The fire shuddered. Every place I went, Rosalie said. I asked about him. Silver Ridge keeps coming up. Someone there knows something. I can feel it. She wrapped the bird back up carefully, the same way it had been wrapped before, and put it back in her pocket. Then she looked at Wyatt directly, with that same steady gaze she'd turned on him in the saloon, and said, I don't need you to save me, Wyatt, I never did. He met her eyes. I need your help finding my brother, she said. The storm worked at the shutters. The fire settled. Wyatt Callahan, who had spent 6 years on this mountain specifically to avoid having reasons to go back down into the world, looked at the woman sitting across his fire from him and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Purpose. Not the blunt survival-driven purpose of checking trap lines and laying in wood against winter. Something different. Something that moved through his chest like a current in cold water. Silver Ridge is 3 days' ride from here, he said. Rosalie didn't move, I know. It's not a safe place for a woman alone, I know that, too. A pause. Are you saying you won't help? He looked at the fire for a long moment. Then he looked at her. I'm saying, he said quietly. We're going to need more supplies than I've got. Something shifted in her face. So small, so carefully controlled, but Wyatt saw it. It was the look of a person who had spent so long expecting nothing that the arrival of something felt almost like pain. We, she said. We, he said. She looked down at her hands for a moment. When she looked back up, her eyes were bright, but her voice was steady. Why, she asked. The same question she'd been asking since the saloon. The one he'd never quite answered. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Because, he said, finally, some things are worth coming down off the mountain for. And outside, the storm howled against the cabin, and the fire burned warm and steady between them. And somewhere in the eastern mountains, a young man named Samuel Bennett waited for the sister who had never, not for a single day, stopped looking for him. The morning they decided to ride for Silver Ridge, Rosalie was already packed before Wyatt finished his coffee. He noticed that. She hadn't brought much. The cloth bundle with Samuel's carving tucked into her coat pocket, a small canvas bag with a change of clothes, and the practical, no-nonsense efficiency of a woman who had learned long ago that everything she owned needed to be ready to move on short notice. She stood by the door watching him finish his cup without a word. And there was something in the way she stood, not impatient, not nervous, just ready, that told him she had been holding herself like that for 3 years. Coiled, waiting for the moment when something finally moved in the right direction. Wyatt drained his cup, set it on the table, and said, We ride slow the first hour. Trail still iced from the storm. I know, she said. You don't know this trail. I know ice, she said simply, and went out to help saddle the horse. He bought a second horse in the first settlement they passed through a small, hardscrabble place called Dunmore that barely qualified as a town. Just a trading post and 4 or 5 structures leaning against each other for warmth. The horse was a sturdy bay mare, not young but sound. And the man who sold her looked at Rosalie with the kind of sideways assessment that Wyatt recognized immediately and liked not at all. He paid for the mare quickly and got them moving before the man had a chance to say whatever he was assembling behind his eyes. Rosalie didn't comment on it. She mounted the bay without assistance and settled into the saddle like she'd been riding her whole life. Which, Wyatt was beginning to understand, she probably had. They made good time through the first day. The terrain was open and the sky was hard and blue. The kind of winter sky that looked bright but delivered no warmth. And their breath came out in steady plumes as they rode. Wyatt set the pace and Rosalie matched it without complaint or comment. And between them the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. It was around midday when she said without preamble, "Tell me about Silver Ridge." He shifted in the saddle. "Mining camp, or it was, 5 or 6 years ago when the silver was still running good. They pulled a lot of money out of those hills. Then the veins started to thin, and the money got harder to find, and the men who owned the operation started getting creative about how they kept their costs down." Creative, she repeated. "They stopped paying fair wages, started charging the workers for their lodging, their tools, their food, their gear, charging more than the wages covered. So the men ended up in debt to the company. Once you were in debt to Hawthorne's operation, it was near impossible to get out a beat. Hawthorne, Edwin Hawthorne. He owns Silver Ridge, or he did. I don't know what the situation is now. I've been out of the way of news for a while." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. "Samuel was 23 when I lost track of him. Young, needed work. He wouldn't have understood what he was walking into." "No," Wyatt agreed. "Most young men don't. He's smart," she said, and there was a fierceness to it. A quiet intensity that made it something other than simple sisterly pride. It was the fierceness of someone defending a truth against years of being told the opposite. "Samuel is smarter than any of them would have given him credit for. He learned to read on his own after our folks died. He taught himself carpentry. He could fix nearly anything." She paused. "He didn't deserve whatever happened to him there." "No," Wyatt said. "He didn't." They rode on. By late afternoon they reached a stretch of trail that ran along a high ridge, exposed to the wind off the peaks, and the cold there was something else entirely, a vicious, personal cold that found every gap and worked at it with intention. Rosalie pulled her coat tighter and kept riding. Wyatt watched her from the corner of his eye and said nothing. She didn't need him to. It was when they started down the far side of the ridge that they heard the riders. 3 of them, coming up fast from below, moving with the particular purposeful energy of men who wanted to get somewhere quickly and didn't much care what was in their way. Wyatt pulled his horse up and put a hand out toward Rosalie. A reflex, and she'd already stopped her mare and was watching the trail below with sharp, steady eyes. The riders came around the bends and slowed when they saw Wyatt and Rosalie blocking the narrow path. The one in front was a broad man with a red scarf and a face that had been broken and rearranged more than once. He looked at Wyatt the way men on certain errands looked at obstacles with a flat, "Move aside," he said. Wyatt kept his horse where it was. "Trail's wide enough for all of us if you slow down." The man's eyes moved to Rosalie. Something shifted in his expression, not interest exactly. More a kind of blank calculation. "What's your business up this way?" "Private," Wyatt said. "Everything's private till it ain't." The man's hand rested on his thigh. Close to, but not on his sidearm. "You headed for Silver Ridge?" Wyatt said nothing. Which was, he knew itself, an answer. The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Rosalie again, and this time there was something in his face that Wyatt didn't like at all. Recognition. Or something close to it. The wrong kind of recognition. The kind that meant he knew something about her, or thought he did. Or was deciding that he did. The man said, and touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, a gesture that managed to be entirely without courtesy, and put his horse up the slope past them. The other 2 followed. Wyatt held his horse until all 3 were past and well up the trail. Rosalie said, "He recognized me. I thought so too. Or he recognized what I am. Someone looking for something. Someone who came from outside." She looked at the trail the riders had gone up. "Wyatt, if Hawthorne has people watching, who comes through? Then he knows we're coming," Wyatt finished. "Or he'll know by tomorrow morning." She turned to look at him. Her jaw was set, but her eyes were clear and direct. "We still going? Are you?" The wind cut between them. Rosalie straightened in the saddle and looked back toward the direction they'd been heading. "Samuel's been there 3 years," she said. "He's waited long enough." They rode. They made camp that night in a shallow draw off the main trail. Protected from the wind by the slope of the hill, Wyatt built a small fire just enough for warmth. Not enough to throw light far, and they ate from the supplies he'd packed without much ceremony. Rosalie sat across the fire from him and held her hands toward the heat. And after a while she said, "How long were you on the mountain?" He thought about it. 6 years, give or take. By choice. She considered. What happened? Before the mountain, I mean. You don't have to tell me, she added. In a tone that made clear she meant it, that she wasn't asking as a transaction. Some kind of even exchange for what she'd told him about Samuel. Wyatt looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said, "I had a family, a son. He was 3 years old." He stopped. Started again more carefully. There was a fever. Came through the town we were living in, Sutherland. Over near the Wyoming border. Took a lot of people. Took them. He picked up a stick and pushed at the edge of the fire. After that, I didn't see much point in being around people. So I stopped. Rosalie was quiet for a while. "I'm sorry," she said. And the thing that made it land differently than it usually did when people said it was that she didn't follow it with anything. She didn't try to put a frame around it or offer it a silver edge. She just let it exist as what it was. "It was a long time ago," Wyatt said. "It doesn't sound like it was a long time ago," she said. Gentle, but honest. He glanced at her. She was looking at the fire, not at him. Some things don't get further away just because time passes. She nodded slowly. Like she understood that completely. Like she had her own version of it. The fire crackled. An owl moved somewhere in the dark above them. The cold was deep and patient, and the stars were extraordinary, the kind you only saw this far from anything that produced light, and for a little while neither of them spoke. And it was not uncomfortable in the least. Then Rosalie said, very quietly, "He used to tell me it didn't matter. Samuel, what people said about how I looked. He'd say, 'Rosie, a person's size is the smallest thing about them.' He was 14 when he said that. He meant it completely." She shook her head once. "I never knew another person who meant things completely the way he did." Wyatt watched the side of her face. The firelight on it. The particular expression of someone reconstructing something precious from memory and checking. Quietly, to make sure all the pieces were still there. "We'll find him," he said. She looked at him then. Directly. "You sound certain." "I tend to be certain about things I intend to do." Something happened in her eyes. Something that came and went so quickly he couldn't have said exactly what it was. Only that it changed her face for a moment, in a way that made her look younger, and very tired and very determined all at once. "All right," she said. And then, with the faintest trace of something that was almost a smile. "Good night, Wyatt." "Good night, Rosalie." He kept the first watch. She slept. They arrived at the edges of Silver Ridge the following afternoon. And it announced itself before they could see it, the smell of it first. Wood smoke and something sulfurous from the processing equipment. And then the sound, a low constant mechanical groan that was the stamp mill running. And then the settlement itself coming into view as they crested a low hill. A sprawling, ugly arrangement of structures built for function, and nothing else. Spread across the base of a scarred hillside where the mining had eaten into the earth and left raw wounds in the rock. Rosalie pulled her mare to a stop beside him at the top of the hill and looked down at it. 3 years, she said. Wyatt said nothing. "Whatever's down there," she said. "We're going to find out." They rode down. Silver Ridge was the kind of place that had 2 categories of people. Those who ran things, and those who served the people who ran things. The difference was obvious at a glance. There was a main street of sorts, with a company store, a mine office, a bunkhouse for the workers. And at the far end, separated by distance and intention, a larger structure, the kind that had glass in the windows and curtains behind the glass. They drew attention immediately. Not dramatic attention. Nobody stopped and stared with their mouths open. But Wyatt felt the shift, the particular quality of awareness that moved through a place when something unfamiliar entered it. Eyes cut toward them and away. Conversations dropped in volume. A man sweeping the steps of the company store paused and watched them for a moment, too long before going back to his broom. Wyatt kept his pace easy, unhurried. Rosalie rode straight beside him without looking right or left, her chin level, her eyes moving steadily over the settlement like she was cataloging it. They tied their horses at the post outside the company store and went in. The man behind the counter was thin and gray-haired with the slightly frantic energy of someone who was always aware that he was answerable to someone above him and was never entirely sure how he was doing. "Help you," he said. "Looking for information," Wyatt said. "About a worker who came through here about 3 years back." Name of Samuel Bennett. The man's face did a quick internal reorganization, like furniture being moved hastily into a back room before guests arrived. "Don't know that name," he said. "He'd be about 26 now. Dark hair, medium height. Good with his hands. Might have been doing carpentry work. Lot of men come through here," the man said. "I can't be expected to remember every." "He would have been memorable," Rosalie said from behind Wyatt. The man looked at her, registered her. His expression shifted into the particular blankness that was itself a kind of decision. "I told you I don't know the name," he said. Wyatt put both hands flat on the counter and leaned in slightly. Not aggressively, just enough to reduce the distance between them to something more personal. "I understand you've got a position here to consider," he said, keeping his voice low and entirely reasonable, "and I respect that. But the man we're looking for is this woman's brother. And she's been 3 years trying to find him. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Politely, before I start asking less politely." The man's eyes moved between Wyatt and Rosalie and back to Wyatt. His throat moved. "You should talk to Mace Dillon," he said, barely above a whisper. "He's been here longer than anyone. He's in the bunkhouse. Second shift doesn't start for another hour." He looked down at the counter. "I didn't tell you that." "Tell me," Wyatt said. The man nodded once, sharply, and went to the back of the store and didn't come back out. They found Mace Dillon sitting on a bench outside the bunkhouse, working on a piece of tack with the slow, methodical focus of a man who had learned to keep his hands busy so his mind didn't eat him alive. He was somewhere in his 50s, built like a man who had swung a pickaxe for 30 years, with hands that were all knuckle and scar. He looked up when they approached, and his eyes went to Rosalie first, not in the assessing way that other men's had. Something different, something that made Wyatt's attention sharpen. "You're Rosalie Bennett," the man said. Rosalie stopped walking. "How do you know my name?" Mace looked around, a quick, practiced survey of who was near and watching, and then looked back at them. "Because Samuel told me you'd come," he said. "Mace, one day my sister's going to show up here looking for me. And when she does, you tell her I didn't run." The sound Rosalie made was not quite a word. It came out of somewhere beneath words. Wyatt put a hand on her arm, steadying, and she didn't shake it off. "Where is he?" she said. Her voice was steady, remarkable, really, how steady it was. "Where is Samuel?" Mace looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. "That's the thing, miss. That's the part that's going to be hard to hear." Rosalie stepped forward. "Tell me, all of it right now," Mace Dillon told them. Samuel Bennett had arrived at Silver Ridge 3 years ago. 18 months after the vein had started to thin, and Edwin Hawthorne had shifted his operation into what Macy called the squeeze, systematically restructuring worker contracts, inflating charges for company housing and equipment, and engineering debt that was mathematically impossible to repay. By the time Samuel understood what he'd walked into, he owed the company more than 6 months of wages. He'd tried to leave anyway. Hawthorne's men had brought him back. He'd tried to organize the other workers. That had gone worse. There had been a confrontation about 8 months in, Between Samuel and one of Hawthorne's foremen, a man named Creed Bolden, large and without much in the way of conscience, who served as the operations enforcement arm. During that confrontation, Samuel had been beaten badly enough that he'd spent 2 weeks unable to work. Then they'd charged him for the 2 weeks he missed. His debt doubled. After that, May said Samuel had gone quiet. Not broken, Mays was specific about that, his voice hardening slightly when he said it, not broken. But strategic. He started paying attention to things. Watching how the books were kept. Listening to conversations he wasn't supposed to hear. Writing things down in a small journal he kept hidden in a gap in the bunkhouse wall. He figured out what Hawthorne was doing, Mays said. Not just the wage business, the land business. There's a parcel of ground that the federal government surveyed for homesteading. Runs along the eastern edge of the mining claim. Hawthorne's been selling rights to that ground to miners on contract, letting them believe they can work off their debt and own a piece of land at the end of it. But the deeds he's giving them are worthless. The land rights he's selling were transferred to a shell company he controls under a different name. Years ago. The workers don't own anything. They never did. Rosalie had gone very still. This is Samuel documented it, May said. That journal of his, he spent months building the record. Names, dates, transaction amounts, deed numbers. He told me he was going to get it out, get it to a federal land agent. Get it to someone who could do something with it. What happened? Wyatt said. Mays was quiet for a moment. About 6 weeks ago. Bolden found the journal. The word landed in the space between them like a stone into water. Where is Samuel now? Rosalie's voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. He ain't dead, Mays said quickly. I want you to hear that first. He ain't dead. But Hawthorne moved him, took him out of the main camp. Put him up in the old assay building on the north end of the claim. It's a storage building now, mostly. But it locks from the outside. He's being held, Wyatt said. Not a question. They're calling it protective custody, Mays said. With a tone that made his opinion of that phrase entirely clear. Saying Samuel attacked Bolden and needs to be held until the situation's sorted out. But what they're really doing is keeping him somewhere quiet until Hawthorne can figure out how to make sure whatever Samuel knows dies with it. Rosalie turned away from both of them and walked several feet. And Wyatt watched her stand there with her back to them and her hands at her sides. And he could see from the set of her shoulders the enormous effort she was making to process all of it. To hold herself together, to think clearly when every instinct she had was probably screaming at her to run toward the north end of the claim and start tearing that building apart. Then she turned back around. Her face was composed. Her eyes were burning. Is the journal still there? She said. Or did Hawthorne destroy it? Mace's expression shifted. Something that might have been respect. That's the question. Isn't it? He looked at Wyatt. Bolden found the journal and took it to Hawthorne. But Samuel had already made copies. I know because I helped him. There's a second copy hidden in a different place. Somewhere on this property. Samuel told me where. Told me to give the location to the right person if anything happened to him. He paused. I've been waiting 3 years for the right person to show up. Rosalie looked at Mace Dillon steadily. Tell me, he did. That evening, Wyatt sat outside the bunkhouse with Mays while Rosalie was inside, eating with some of the workers who had quietly attached themselves to her over the course of 2 hours in a way that Wyatt found entirely unsurprising. She had a gift for it, not for charming people, nothing so calculated as that, but for making people feel that they were being genuinely seen. She asked about their families, remembered names, listened in a particular way that made people want to keep talking. 6 men who had been cautious and silent all day were telling her things by the end of the first evening. Mays watched the window of the bunkhouse and said, "She's something, she is," Wyatt said. Samuel talked about her constantly. First 6 months he was here, every story started with my sister Rosalie. Mays smiled briefly. Men teased him about it. He didn't care at all. Wyatt looked toward the north end of the property, toward the dark shape of the assay building at the far edge of the claim. How many men does Hawthorne keep around the building? Usually 2. Sometimes 1 at night if he thinks nobody's paying attention. Bolden checks on it himself twice a day. Mace paused. Creed Bolden is not a good man, Mr. Callahan. I want you to understand what I mean when I say that I understand. He enjoys his work, Mace said quietly. The enforcement part. The part where he can make someone understand their position. He looked down at his hands. He worked Samuel over more than once after that first time, when Samuel tried to organize. There were other times Wyatt was quiet for a moment. How is he? Thin, tired, but his mind still right. Mays looked at him. You can see it in his eyes when they let him out for air. He's still thinking, still planning. He hasn't let them take that. Inside the bunkhouse, there was a low sound of conversation and someone's laughing at something Rosalie had said. Wyatt could see her through the window, sitting at the long wooden table. Talking, her hands moving to make a point, the men around her leaning in slightly the way people leaned in toward things that had warmth. She's been carrying that carving for 3 years, Wyatt said. The bird? Mace said. Wyatt looked at him. He told me about it. Mace's voice was careful. Said the last thing he gave her before she left to come find him was a carved bird. Said he knew she'd keep it. Said Rosalie never let go of things that mattered. Wyatt looked back at the window. At Rosalie. At the way she filled a room she'd only been in for 2 hours, as though she'd been there for years. The way people moved toward her, without seeming to notice they were doing it. He thought about what she'd said at the fire the night before. About Samuel being the only person who had ever looked at her the way she deserved to be looked at. He thought about the way she'd lifted her chin in that saloon. Not in defiance, not in performance, but in the stubborn, bedrock insistence of someone who had decided that the world's cruelty was not going to be the final word on who she was. And something settled in Wyatt Callahan's chest, something that had been loose and restless and without anchor for 6 years. And it settled the way the last piece of something settles when it finds the place it was always meant to be. He didn't name it, but he felt it, and then across the settlement, a door opened on the large building at the far end of the main street. And in the light that spilled out of it, Wyatt saw the silhouette of a large man, broad, slow-moving, the deliberate, unhurried walk of someone who knew he did not need to hurry, and even at this distance, even in the dark. Something about the way Creed Bolden moved across the ground toward the assay building told Wyatt everything Massey had told him was true. And then some. Bolden went to the door of the building. Knocked on it twice hard, the way you knocked on something you controlled. There was a pause. Then he unlocked it and went inside. Wyatt watched. Rosalie came out of the bunkhouse and stood beside him. And he knew without looking at her that she had seen it too. That's him, not Bolden. She meant the building. Yes, she was quiet for a moment, then she said, We have the location of the copy. We have Mace and at least 4 other men who are willing to testify about what Hawthorne's been doing. And we know where Samuel is. So tomorrow, she said. And her voice was quiet and clear and absolutely certain. We go get my brother. Wyatt looked at Bolden's silhouette inside the lit window of the assay building. At the man moving around in there with the confidence of someone who had never in his life had reason to believe the world would not arrange itself according to his will. Tomorrow, Wyatt agreed, and for the first time in 6 years, Wyatt Callahan did not spend the night wishing he was back on his mountain. They were up before first light. Rosalie didn't sleep much, Wyatt knew, because he didn't either. And he could hear her on the other side of the bunkhouse partition. The quiet sound of someone lying awake and thinking hard. Not tossing, not restless, just awake. The particular stillness of a mind working through something it cannot afford to get wrong. Mays was already outside when they came out, standing in the cold with 2 cups of coffee he'd made on the bunkhouse stove. And he handed one to each of them without a word. That was the kind of man he was, Wyatt thought. The kind that understood what a moment needed and provided it without being asked. They drank their coffee standing up, watching the sky begin to shift from black to the deep blue that came just before dawn. And Rosalie said, "Walk me through Hawthorne's morning." Mays wrapped both hands around his cup. He comes out of the main house around 7, takes breakfast in the mine office, the cook brings it over. After that he walks the operation, checks in with the shift foreman, looks at the previous day's numbers. He doesn't go near the assay building in the morning. That's Bolden's territory, and Bolden sleeps late. Man like that always does. Mace's voice was flat. He's usually not moving before 8, sometimes later. Rosalie looked at Wyatt. That gives us a window between 6 and 7, Wyatt said. The guard at the building, how alert? Depends on the night he had, Mace said. There's only the one man overnight now. Hawthorne got comfortable. He doesn't think anyone's coming for Samuel. He thinks everyone who might care is either bought off or too scared. Rosalie said. He's wrong about that. Yes, ma'am, May said. He surely is. The plan was not complicated, which was why Wyatt trusted it. Complicated plans had too many places where things could go wrong. And things always went wrong. What they had was this. Mays would go to the assay building on the pretense of delivering the early shift report, something he did occasionally, enough that his presence there would not be unusual. He would get the guard talking. Wyatt would come around the back of the building, where there was a second entrance used for loading equipment that hadn't been bolted properly in months because nobody had bothered. Rosalie would wait with the horses at the east edge of the property, near a gap in the fence line that Mays had identified, with the hidden copy of Samuel's journal already in her possession, retrieved before dawn from the place Samuel had told Mays to look. That was the plan. What actually happened was both simpler and considerably more complicated than any of them anticipated. Mays walked toward the assay building at 10 minutes before 6, shift report in hand, moving with the practiced casualness of a man who had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do in a place like Silver Ridge was look like you were trying. Wyatt circled wide around the back of the operation, moving through the cold dark with the specific silence of a man who had spent 6 years learning how to exist in wilderness without disturbing it. He reached the back entrance of the assay building and tested the door. It moved. Not smoothly, the hinges were stiff with cold and disuse, but it moved, and he eased it open inch by inch, breathing slow. Listening past the sound of his own heartbeat inside, the building smelled of old metal and damp wood and something else. Something that it took him a moment to identify, and when he did, his jaw tightened. It was the smell of a space that had been lived in without adequate provisions, without enough heat, without enough food, without the basic dignities that most people didn't even think of as dignities until they were taken away. He stood in the dark for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. There was a figure on a cot in the far corner of the room. Wyatt moved toward it, slow, and said very quietly, "Samuel Bennett." The figure came awake fast, not the groggy, confused waking of someone deeply asleep, but the immediate, full alert waking of someone who had learned to sleep light. He was on his feet before Wyatt had taken 2 more steps, and even in the dark Wyatt could see him assessing exit. Threat size, intent in the span of about 2. Then Samuel said, "You're not one of Hawthorne's men." "No," Wyatt said. "My name's Wyatt Callahan. Your sister sent me." The silence that followed was not long, but it was deep. "Rosalie," Samuel said, "just the name. The way you said something you'd been holding in your mouth for 3 years, and finally let it become sound." "She's here," Wyatt said. "She's outside with the horses. We need to move right now." Samuel Bennett was on his feet in the next breath. He was thinner than he should have been. Mace had said so, and the reality confirmed it, and there was a careful way he moved that spoke to injuries improperly healed. But his eyes, even in the dark, even after 3 years of what this place had done to him, were exactly what Mace had said, clear and thinking, and entirely unbroken. He grabbed something from beneath the cot, a small bundle, wrapped in cloth, and looked at Wyatt. "I've got what I need," he said. "Let's go." They were halfway to the back door when the front of the building came open. Not Mace. Mace was still outside, still talking to the guard, which meant this was somebody else. And the somebody walked through the front door with a lantern held high and the particular gait of a man who owned every room he walked into. And the light hit Creed Bolden's face before Wyatt had time to do anything but step sideways and put himself between Bolden and Samuel. Bolden stopped. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at Samuel behind him. He looked at the back door, which was still open, which told him everything the scene itself hadn't already told him. "Well," Bolden said. His voice was the kind of smooth that took effort, the voice of a man who had learned that appearing relaxed made other men uncertain. He set the lantern down on a crate and straightened up to his full height, which was considerable. He was not holding a weapon, but he had the easy confidence of a man who didn't feel he needed one. "You picked a bad morning to play hero, friend," Bolden said to Wyatt. "I've had worse mornings," Wyatt said. Bolden's eyes moved to Samuel. "Get back on that cot, boy, before this gets worse for everyone." Samuel didn't move. He stepped up beside Wyatt instead, and the fact that he did it with shaking hands but did it anyway told Wyatt something definitive about the kind of man Samuel Bennett was. "I'm not your boy," Samuel said, "and I'm done taking orders from you." Something shifted in Bolden's face. The smoothness cracked, just at the edges. The real thing underneath it was uglier. "3 years I've been patient with you," he said. And his voice had changed lower, more personal. 3 years. "And you think one drifter showing up changes anything?" "It changes everything," Wyatt said. Bolden looked at him steadily. "You don't know what you walked into." "I know exactly what I walked into." Wyatt kept his voice even. "I know about the land scheme. I know about the false deeds. I know about the wage fraud. And I know there's documentation of all of it in the hands of someone you can't get to." He paused. "Your boss's operation is over, Mr. Bolden. The only question right now is how this particular morning ends for you." Bolden was quiet for a moment. Then he came forward. He was fast for a big man, faster than Wyatt had expected, and he closed the distance between them in 2 strides and swung hard. The kind of swing that had ended conversations before. And Wyatt moved, turning into it rather than away, so the blow caught his shoulder instead of his jaw. And the impact was enough to stagger him but not put him down. And he came back around and hit Bolden in the side of the face with everything he had. Bolden's head snapped sideways. He shook it once, almost like he was surprised, and looked at Wyatt with something that was very nearly respect. And then they were into it, properly close, brutal. The kind of fight that happened in tight spaces between men who both knew what they were doing, where there was no room for anything graceful, just endurance and intent. Samuel grabbed the lantern off the crate and moved toward the front door to keep the exit open, which was smart, exactly what you wanted someone to do when they didn't have a weapon. Keep the way out clear, and don't get in the way of the people who were handling it. Bolden got a hand on Wyatt's coat and used his size to drive him back into a shelf of equipment. And metal came down around them both with a tremendous clatter. And Wyatt hit the floor and rolled and came up with a length of iron pipe that had fallen with everything else. And he brought it up between them and said, "That's enough." Bolden looked at the pipe. At Wyatt's face. He was breathing hard. There was blood on his jaw from where Wyatt had hit him. He was the kind of man who fought because he enjoyed it and because he'd always won. And the experience of not winning was doing something visible to his expression. "You walk out of here," Bolden said, "and you're done. Hawthorne will have men after you before you hit the tree line." "He's welcome to try," Wyatt said. "You don't know who Edwin Hawthorne is." "I know what he is," Wyatt said. "And I know what the law does to men like him when someone puts the evidence in front of a federal agent." Something moved in Bolden's face. Fast. A flicker of something Wyatt couldn't read. He didn't wait to read it. He said to Samuel, "Go," and Samuel went through the front door. And Wyatt backed toward the same exit, keeping the pipe and his eyes on Bolden until he was through the door and out into the cold, silver light of early morning. He ran. Rosalie saw them coming. She was exactly where she was supposed to be at the east gap in the fence line, holding 3 horses, her eyes moving constantly between the building they'd come from and the main street and the tree line beyond the property. The moment she saw Samuel, she was off her horse. She crossed the ground between them at a dead run and hit her brother like something released from a very long tension. And Samuel caught her and held on, and neither of them said anything at all for the first several seconds. They just held on, the way people held on when they'd spent 3 years not knowing if they'd ever have the chance. Wyatt looked away, gave them that. Then he heard the shouting from the direction of the main street, and the window for sentiment closed. "We have to ride," he said. Rosalie pulled back from Samuel and looked at his face, really looked. Cataloging him the way she'd probably cataloged him in her mind 1,000 times over 3 years. Checking the reality of him against the version she'd been carrying, and he could see the moment she registered what the years had cost him. Her expression didn't break. It tightened into something fierce and purposeful. "Are you all right?" she said. "Can you ride?" Samuel looked at her. "Rosie, I've been waiting 3 years. I can ride." She grabbed his arm and got him toward the horse. And Wyatt was already mounted, already watching the direction of the shouting, already calculating. They went through the gap in the fence and into the trees. And behind them, Silver Ridge woke up to the fact that its most important prisoner was gone. They rode hard for the first hour, putting as much distance between themselves and the settlement as the terrain would allow, pushing through cold and rough ground and the occasional stretch of ice on the trail that required them to slow regardless of what was behind them. Samuel rode without complaint, though Wyatt could see the effort it cost him, the way he shifted his weight carefully, the set of his jaw when the horse's movement jarred something that hadn't healed right. Rosalie rode beside her brother the entire time. She kept glancing at him. Not hovering, nothing so soft as that. Just watching. The way you watched something precious that you were terrified of losing again. When they finally slowed to give the horses a rest on a long flat stretch of trail, Samuel said, "The journal, I have it," Rosalie said. She tapped the inside of her coat, the copy Maze kept. "It's here." Samuel let out a long, slow breath. "How much of it did you read?" "Enough," she said. He looked at her. "Then you know what Hawthorne's been doing isn't just the wage scheme. There's more." Wyatt said, "Tell us." Samuel looked at him, a direct, assessing look, the same quality of attention as his sister's, the same steadiness. Rosalie said, "Your name, but not much else." "Wyatt Callahan." "I came with your sister to find you." "Why?" Rosalie said. "Samuel, it's a fair question," Samuel said, still watching Wyatt. "A man doesn't ride into a place like Silver Bridge for a stranger." "No," Wyatt agreed. "He doesn't." "She needed help," Wyatt said. "And it was the right thing to do." He met Samuel's eyes. "That's all the reason I've ever needed for anything." Samuel held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, with a particular quality to it, the nod of a man giving something considered. Not just polite. "All right," he said, "then I'll tell you what I know. The land fraud," Samuel explained as they rode, "went considerably deeper than inflated wages and false deeds. Edwin Hawthorne had been operating a systematic scheme for nearly 8 years, acquiring federal land designations through falsified surveys, reselling those designations to workers and small investors under contracts that appeared legitimate, and then using those same workers' labor to extract resources from the land while legally retaining ownership of everything produced. He had connections in the Territorial Land Office, a deputy surveyor named Artis Fenn, who had been altering official survey records in exchange for a percentage of the take. And there was a bank in the county seat, the Territorial Savings and Loan, where a man named Gould had been processing the fraudulent transactions and keeping 2 sets of books. It's not just Hawthorne, Samuel said, it's a system. 3 men at the center of it, and a dozen smaller players around them who either know and benefit or know and stay quiet because they're afraid. How much of this is in the journal? Wyatt said. All of it. Names, dates, document numbers, transaction records. I spent 18 months building that record. Samuel's voice had a quiet intensity to it. The voice of someone who had converted fear and anger into something precise and purposeful. I knew that if I ever got out, I needed it to be enough. Enough that someone couldn't just make it go away. It'll be enough, Rosalie said. And then she added, "You should have left, Samuel. First realized what was happening. You should have run." "I couldn't leave the others," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "I suppose you couldn't." They were an hour from the edge of the range, where the terrain would open up and the trails would become roads. When Wyatt heard the riders, he held up a fist and the 3 of them stopped. Rosalie heard it a second later, the sound of horses moving at speed, coming from a direction that didn't make sense for travelers. Coming from ahead of them. "That's not Hawthorne's men following us," Wyatt said. "No," Rosalie said. "They're cutting us off." Samuel looked at the terrain around them, reading it. "There's a fork about a quarter-mile ahead. Left goes down toward the valley road. Right goes up toward the high pass. The valley road is where they'll be waiting," Wyatt said. "The high pass is barely passable this time of year." "Barely," Wyatt said, "is not the same as not." Rosalie looked at him. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Hawthorne is smart enough to block the obvious route," Wyatt said. "But I've been navigating these mountains for 6 years. There's a way through the high country that doesn't show on any survey map, because nobody with a survey map has ever bothered to look for it." Samuel said. "You're certain?" "I know this range," Wyatt said. "Trust me." Samuel looked at him, then at his sister. Rosalie looked back at Samuel, and something passed between them, the fast, almost wordless communication of siblings who had learned to read each other under pressure, and Samuel said, "We trust him. They took the right fork. The high pass was brutal. There was no other word for it. The cold at that elevation was a different animal than the cold below, thinner, harder, with a wind chill that made the temperature feel impossible. The horses labored. The trail was narrow and uneven and covered in a layer of ice over packed snow that required all of them to move with a specific focused attention that left no room for conversation. Samuel held on to his saddle and kept his head down and didn't complain once. They were most of the way through the worst stretch when the sound of the riders below reached them, distant but clear in the cold air. The sound of horses moving fast down in the valley, going somewhere quickly and finding nothing there. Rosalie looked down at the sound and then back up at the pass ahead of them. "They'll figure it out," she said. "Yes," Wyatt said. "But it'll take them time, and time is what we need." What he didn't say was what he was also thinking, that getting through the pass was only half of it. That even on the other side, they were 3 people with a journal full of evidence against powerful men, in territory where those men had spent years building relationships and influence, and the particular kind of insurance that came from knowing where bodies were buried. He thought about Mace, back at Silver Ridge. He thought about the 4 other men who had been willing to talk, who had eaten dinner with Rosalie and told her things because she had looked at them and listened and made them feel that what had happened to them mattered. Witnesses mattered. Documents mattered, but right now, getting Samuel Bennett across this mountain mattered more than anything else. The pass opened up on the far side into a long slope that ran down toward a different valley, broader, more sheltered, with a road at its base that Wyatt knew led east toward the county seat. He'd ridden it once, years ago, in a different life. They came down off the slope with the horses blowing hard and the worst of it behind them, and Samuel pulled up his horse and looked back at the pass they'd come through, and then at the valley opening ahead of them, and he took a long, careful breath. 3 years, he said, mostly to himself. Rosalie brought her mare alongside his horse and reached over and put her hand on his arm. He covered her hand with his. They stayed like that for a moment. Wyatt looked away again. Then Samuel said, "There's something I need to tell you. Both of you." He straightened in the saddle. "There's someone in the county seat who I've been trying to reach for over a year. Before Hawthorne locked me up. A federal land agent named Harlan Pruitt. He's been investigating irregularities in the territorial survey records. He doesn't know about Fenn yet. He doesn't know the full scope of it. But he's been looking." Samuel looked at Wyatt. "If we can get to Pruitt with the journal, before Hawthorne can get ahead of this, before he can call in whatever favors he has in the land office, then Hawthorne can't make this disappear," Rosalie finished. "It falls apart from the inside," Samuel said, "the whole system. Because the land office is the foundation of it. Without the surveyor's corruption, none of the rest holds." Wyatt thought about Bolden's face in the assay building. The flicker of something he hadn't been able to read. He understood it now. It wasn't fear of the journal. It was fear of Pruitt. Somehow Bolden had known Pruitt was out there. And that was what had rattled him, not the documents themselves, but the possibility of those documents reaching someone already looking. "Hawthorne knows about Pruitt," Wyatt said. Samuel stared at him. "How?" "Because Bolden went pale when I mentioned federal agents. Men like Bolden don't go pale at the idea of local law. They go pale when there's something already in motion that they can't control." Samuel absorbed this. "Then we have to move fast. Hawthorne will try to get to Pruitt before we do. Try to discredit him, or bury the investigation, or find something to use against him." "How far is the county seat?" Rosalie said. 2 days hard ride," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "Then we'd better ride hard." But Samuel put up a hand. "There's one more thing." He reached inside his shirt and pulled out the cloth bundle he'd grabbed from under the cot before they left the assay building. He unwrapped it, and inside was not documents or evidence or anything that had to do with Hawthorne at all. It was a small wooden carving, another bird, the twin of the one Rosalie had carried in her pocket for 3 years. Same size, same shape, the same careful work in the wings. "I kept making them," Samuel said quietly, "every time I finished one. I'd make another. Try." And he stopped. "I needed to believe you were still out there looking. So I kept making the birds." Rosalie stared at it. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the bird she'd been carrying, and held them both, one in each hand, side by side. For a moment she didn't say anything. Then she closed both hands around both birds and pressed them to her chest. And she shut her eyes, and when she opened them, there were tears tracking silently down her face, but her voice, when she spoke, was completely steady. "Let's go," she said. "Let's end this." Wyatt Callahan looked at these two people, the woman who had never stopped looking, and the man who had never stopped believing she would come, and something moved through him that he had no name for and did not try to name. He turned his horse toward the valley road, and then, from somewhere back up on the far side of the pass, he heard it, not riders, not yet, but a sound that would become riders soon enough. A voice or voices carrying on the cold wind. Someone had found the right fort. Someone was coming. He looked at Rosalie. She had already heard it. "How fast can you ride?" he said. She tucked both birds into her coat pocket, straightened in the saddle, and looked at him with the particular expression of someone who had spent 3 years holding herself together, with nothing but love and stubbornness and the refusal to give up. "Faster than they can," she said, and she put her heels to the mare and rode. They rode like the mountain itself was trying to shake them loose. Wyatt kept them off the valley road for the first hour, cutting through terrain that no one following a map would think to try. Old game trails, dry creek beds, the narrow passages between rock formations that he'd learned in 6 years of moving through this country alone. The horses were tired but willing, and Samuel rode without a word of complaint, even though Wyatt could see every rough stretch of ground cost him something he didn't have to spare. Behind them, the voices on the wind had become hoofbeats, and the hoofbeats had grown and then faded as whoever was following took the valley road and found nothing on it. And then there was silence except for their own movement, and the cold, and the sound of the land. When Wyatt finally brought them onto the main road toward the county seat, it was past midday and the horses needed water and rest, and so did Samuel, who was holding himself in the saddle by pride and determination and not much else. They stopped at a creek crossing, and Samuel got down and immediately put a hand on his horse's flank to steady himself. And Rosalie was off her mare and beside him before his legs had finished deciding whether they were going to hold. "I'm all right," he said. "You're not," she said. "Sit down." "Rosie Samuel James Bennett." "Sit down right now." He sat down. The creek bank was cold and the ground was hard, and he sat on it with the careful movements of a man whose body had a longer list of complaints than he was willing to acknowledge. And he leaned his back against a rock and let out a long, slow breath that had a lot of things in it. Wyatt watered the horses and gave them a few minutes and didn't hover. He understood the particular dignity of needing to be seen as capable. And he understood that right now Samuel needed a few minutes to be a man who had just escaped 3 years of captivity, without an audience, taking inventory of everything the captivity had cost him. Rosalie sat beside her brother and didn't talk. She just sat close enough that their shoulders touched, the way siblings sat when they were young, and the world was large and frightening, and the only reliable warmth was each other. After a while Samuel said, "Tell me how you found me." "All of it." So she told him. She left nothing out: Caleb Mercer and the saloon. Not the 20, not the mountain cabin and the fire, and the slow, careful way she and Wyatt had learned each other over those first days. She told him about Mace, about the men in the bunkhouse who had talked, about the copy of the journal and how they'd retrieved it before dawn. She told all of it plainly, in the direct, unadorned way she told everything. And Samuel listened with his eyes on the water moving over the creek stones. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Wyatt, who was standing a few feet away, checking the horse's feet. "You paid 20 for her," he said. "I did," Wyatt said, without turning around. "Why?" Wyatt straightened up and looked at him. "Because the alternative was walking away, and I couldn't do it." Samuel held his gaze for a long moment. "She hasn't had many people who couldn't do it," he said. Not accusatory, just true. The truth of a brother who had watched his sister move through a world that consistently failed to see her, and had hated it, and had been unable to stop it. "I know," Wyatt said. "She's worth more than anyone in that saloon understood." "I know that too," Wyatt said. "Probably better than most." Something in Samuel's expression shifted, subtle, considered, and he looked at his sister, who was looking at the creek water and pretending she wasn't listening to any of this. And Samuel made some internal calculation that showed only in the slight relaxation around his eyes. "All right," he said. And that was all he said, but it was enough. They got moving again within the hour. The road into the county seat, a town called Garrity. Population somewhere around 2,000, which made it the largest settlement Wyatt had been near in years, came into view in the late afternoon of the second day. They'd made camp the night before in a shallow canyon off the main road, taking turns at watch, sleeping in short rotations. Rosalie had refused to sleep first, insisting on taking the initial watch, and Wyatt had let her, because arguing with her about it was a waste of energy he'd already figured out he didn't have. In the gray light before dawn, she had sat beside the fire with both small carved birds in her hands, turning them over and over slowly, and Wyatt had lain in his bedroll and watched her without her knowing, and felt something in his chest that was too large and too honest to look at directly. Now they rode into Garrity 3 abreast, tired and dusty, and carrying something that could unravel 8 years of carefully constructed fraud. And the first thing they needed was the federal land agent named Harlan Pruitt. Samuel knew where to look. He'd spent months before his imprisonment learning everything he could about Pruitt, from second-hand accounts, which saloon he used, which boarding house he kept a room at when he was in town, which diner he ate breakfast in when he wanted to think. Knowledge gathered carefully, stored carefully, the way a man stored provisions against a winter he knew was coming. they found Pruitt in the diner. He was a compact man in his late 40s, with the kind of face that gave away very little, not unfriendly, but careful. The face of someone who had learned that information was currency, and expressions were part of information. He was eating eggs and reading a folded paper when the three of them came through the door. And he looked up, and something in his assessment of them, the quick inventory of road dusty, trail-worn, clearly urgent, made him set the paper down. "Mr. Pruitt," Samuel said. Pruitt looked at him. "You have the advantage of me, son. My name is Samuel Bennett. I've been trying to reach you for over a year." Samuel reached inside his shirt and pulled out the journal. "I have documentation of a federal land fraud operation running out of Silver Ridge under Edwin Hawthorne's operation. Survey records falsified by your deputy surveyor Artis Fenn. False deeds sold to workers. 2 sets of books at Territorial Savings and Loan, maintained by a man named Gould." He set the journal on the table in front of Pruitt. "Names, dates, deed numbers, transaction records. 18 months of documentation." Pruitt looked at the journal. He looked at Samuel. He looked at Wyatt and Rosalie. He did not touch the journal yet. "Sit down," he said. They sat. Pruitt called for more coffee, not for himself, for them, which was a small thing that told Wyatt something meaningful about the man, and then he opened the journal and began to read. And he read with the focused, methodical attention of someone who had been waiting for exactly this, and was making very sure it was what he thought it was before he let himself believe it. He read for a long time. The diner filled up around them and emptied again, and filled up partway again, and Pruitt kept reading, turning pages with the careful deliberation of a man handling something fragile and important. Finally, he looked up. "You aren't certain about Fenn? I have his signature on 3 altered survey documents," Samuel said. "The originals are in the Federal Land Office. The alterations show up when you compare them to the field survey notes, which Fenn didn't alter because he didn't think anyone would ever look at both together." Pruitt was quiet. "I've had my eye on Fenn for 8 months," he said. "I didn't have enough to move on him." He looked at the journal again. "This is enough. Hawthorne knows you're investigating," Wyatt said. "He's going to come at this from whatever angle he has. We rode out of Silver Ridge 2 days ago with Hawthorne's men behind us. He'll be here, or his people will, trying to get ahead of this." Pruitt looked at him. "How long ago did you leave Silver Ridge, Dawn?" 2 days passed. Pruitt's jaw tightened slightly. "Then we don't have much time." He stood up, pushing back from the table. "I need to get to the telegraph office before Hawthorne's man does. There's a circuit judge in Billings I've been in contact with. If I can get word to him and have him dispatch federal marshals before Hawthorne can muddy the water at the territorial level." He stopped, looked at Samuel. "Can you and your documentation be available to testify?" "That's why I made it," Samuel said. Pruitt nodded. He reached into his coat, produced a card, and put it on the table. "Go to this address. It's a boarding house run by a woman named Clara Midge. She's trustworthy. She knows me. Tell her I sent you. Stay there, stay quiet. Don't go near the land office or the bank until I've had a chance to move." He picked up the journal. "I need to take this." Rosalie said, "We have a copy." Pruitt looked at her. "Smart," he said, and there was something in his tone that was not condescension, but its opposite, a genuine, direct respect. "Keep it somewhere safe, on your person if possible." He put the journal inside his coat. "Give me 4 hours. If I'm not at the boarding house by dark, something's gone wrong and you'll need to make decisions accordingly." "What kind of decisions?" Wyatt said. Pruitt looked at him. "The kind you've clearly already proven capable of making," he said. And he put on his hat and went out the door. Clara Midge's boarding house was 3 blocks from the main street. And Clara Midge herself was exactly the kind of the front ear produced when it wanted to prove it was capable of producing something worthwhile 70 years old. Sharp as January wind, with the no-nonsense hospitality of someone who had fed a lot of people in hard circumstances and considered it simply what people did for each other. She took one look at the 3 of them. heard Pruitt's name, and had them inside and fed within 20 minutes. Samuel ate like a man relearning the experience of eating until he was full. Rosalie watched him do it and didn't say anything. But Wyatt saw her jaw work once hard at some emotion she was managing privately. Clara gave Samuel the room at the top of the stairs, the one with the best bed, and told him to sleep, and he went without argument, which told Wyatt more about how exhausted he truly was than anything he'd said on the road. That left Wyatt and Rosalie in the sitting room, on opposite sides of a small table, with cups of coffee Clara had provided, and the particular quality of silence that came after sustained danger had passed, and left people alone with themselves. Rosalie had her hands wrapped around her cup. She was looking at the table. Wyatt watched her. After a while she said, "He's thinner than he was. When I last saw him, he was 23 and full of himself the way young men are. All energy and certainty." She paused. "They took something from him in there. I can see it in the way he moves. He's got the kind of core that doesn't break," Wyatt said. "Whatever they took, it wasn't that. How can you be sure?" "Because broken men don't spend 18 months building a case," he said. "They don't hold on to documentation at the risk of everything. They don't keep making carved birds to give to a sister they don't know is still coming." She looked up at him. Her eyes were very dark and very direct, the way they always were. "I was so afraid," she said quietly. "The whole ride here. Every mile. I was afraid we'd be too late, or that what Mossy said wasn't the whole truth. Or that..." She stopped. "I've spent 3 years being afraid and not letting myself show it, because if I let it show, it would slow me down." "You don't have to not show it now," he said. She looked at him steadily for a moment. "It's strange," she said. "Being somewhere where I don't have to." He didn't answer that. He didn't think it needed an answer. He just held her gaze and let her have the moment of it, the moment of being somewhere safe enough to admit she had ever been afraid. Then the front door of the boarding house opened. It was not Pruitt. The man who came through the door was young, maybe 25. And he had the look of someone who had been riding fast and had not stopped to think about whether what he was about to do was wise. He was one of Hawthorne's men. Wyatt recognized the red and black checkered coat that 2 of the riders who'd passed them on the trail had been wearing. He looked around the sitting room, saw Wyatt and Rosalie, and his hand went to his hip. Wyatt was out of his chair before the hand got where it was going. He crossed the room in 3 steps and had the man's wrist before the draw was halfway complete, and he applied the specific pressure that made the hand open, whether it wanted to or not. And the gun dropped, and Wyatt walked the man backward into the door he'd just come through and held him there against it. Forearm across his chest, the man was breathing fast. Young, Wyatt thought again. Young and scared and doing someone else's dirty work. "How many of you are in town?" Wyatt said. The man said nothing. "I'm not going to hurt you," Wyatt said. "I just need to know how many." Clara Midge appeared in the doorway of the kitchen with an expression that suggested she had seen considerably worse than this and was not impressed. "Shall I send for the sheriff?" she said. "Not yet," Wyatt said. Rosalie picked up the fallen gun from the floor and looked at the man. "Hawthorne sent you to find us," she said. "Not a question." The man's jaw worked. He was trying to decide something. Wyatt could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, loyalty versus the very clear reality of his current position. "3 of us in town," he finally said. "Rode in this morning. We were told to find you and find out what you gave the land agent. Bolden said if we could get the documents back before Pruitt moves on them." "Bolden is here," Wyatt said. "A beat. He's coming. He's a day behind us. Hawthorne sent him personally." Wyatt looked at Rosalie. She looked back at him, and something moved between them, the fast, wordless kind of communication that took most people years to develop. If they developed it at all. "Where are the other 2? Wyatt said. "One's at the telegraph office," the man said, "trying to delay any messages going out. The other's watching the land office, the telegraph office." Wyatt said it flat and quiet and turned to Clara. "Is there a back way out of here?" "Through the kitchen. Clara said immediately. Out the garden gate, cuts to the alley behind Main Street. Wyatt looked at Rosalie. If Hawthorne's man is delaying telegraphs, Pruitt's message to the circuit judge might not have gotten through. Or Pruitt might not have gotten to the telegraph office at all, she said. They looked at each other for a fraction of a second. Go, they both said, simultaneously, and then Rosalie was moving toward the kitchen, and Wyatt looked at the young man against the door. Stay here, he said. Don't make me regret being decent about this. He locked the man in the sitting room. Clara produced a key from her apron, with the calm efficiency of someone who had anticipated this requirement, and they went through the kitchen, and out the garden gate, and into the alley at a run. The telegraph office was on the far end of Main Street, and they went down the alley parallel to Main rather than on Main itself. Moving fast, Rosalie matched him stride for stride without instruction. At the end of the alley, they stopped and looked around the corner onto the street. The telegraph office was visible from where they stood. Through the window, Wyatt could see two men inside Pruitt, recognizable from his compact build and careful posture, and a second man who was standing between Pruitt and the telegraph operator's station in a way that made his purpose entirely clear. He can't get to the wire, Rosalie said quietly. No, Wyatt thought fast. I need to get inside without whoever that man is drawing a weapon. If it goes loud, it draws the third man from the land office, and then we've got a serious problem in a public street. Then don't let it go loud, Rosalie said. She was already looking at the front of the building, at the window, at the distance from the alley entrance to the door. Calculating. Then she straightened up and walked directly across the street toward the telegraph office. Wyatt said, Rosalie. She was already gone. She pushed through the door of the telegraph office with the purposeful energy of someone on legitimate business. And Wyatt moved the second she went through, crossing the street fast and flattening against the wall beside the door. Listening. Inside, Rosalie, clear and carrying. There you are. I've been looking all over town for you. A pause. The man's voice, confused. Excuse me, my husband, Rosalie said, with a completely convincing note of domestic exasperation. He was supposed to meet me at the Mercantile 20 minutes ago. I thought I saw him come in here. She looked around the room with theatrical dismay. He's not here, Lord, that man. She looked at Pruitt. I'm so sorry to interrupt. Did a tall fellow with a brown hat come through in the last, ma'am? You need to leave, Hawthorne's man said. I just need to know if ma'am. Wyatt came through the door. In the moment that Hawthorne's man turned toward Rosalie, he'd shifted his weight and his attention both, and Wyatt had the full advantage of that. He had the man disarmed and face down on the floor before the telegraph operator had time to do more than push back from his station in alarm. Pruitt looked at Wyatt, then at Rosalie, then back at Wyatt. Your wife, he said. Long story, Wyatt said. My husband, Rosalie said to Pruitt, with a perfectly level expression, was supposed to send a telegraph message. Has he been prevented from doing so? Pruitt looked at the man on the floor. Yes, he said, though not for much longer, I think. He turned to the telegraph operator, who was watching all of this with the wide-eyed professional neutrality of a man who intended to have a very detailed story to tell later. Send it now, Pruitt said. Exactly as I dictated. Priority. The operator sent it. They held that office for 40 minutes, while the telegraph line hummed and the reply came back from Billings in pieces that the operator assembled and handed to Pruitt with hands that were only slightly unsteady. Pruitt read it. Then he read it again. Then he let out a breath that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh, but somewhere between the two. Judge Carver is dispatching 3 federal marshals, he said. They'll be here by tomorrow morning. He folded the paper and put it in his coat with the journal. Edwin Hawthorne is going to have a very difficult week. Bolden is on the road, Wyatt said. One day out. The marshals will be here first, Pruitt said. And when they arrive, Mr. Bolden will find that his particular form of employment has reached its natural conclusion. He looked at Wyatt steadily. You should know Hawthorne's going to fight this. He has money and connections, and he's going to use all of it. This won't be over when the marshals arrive. It'll be the beginning of the legal process. Not the end, we know, Rosalie said. Samuel has been building that case for 3 years. He built it to survive a fight. He'll need to testify, Pruitt said. He'll testify, she said, as long as he's safe to do it. The marshals will ensure that. Pruitt looked at both of them a long, careful look. You two walked Samuel Bennett out of that building and rode 2 days through Hawthorne's men to put that journal in my hands. You should understand what you've done. Those workers at Silver Ridge, the men in debt to a scheme they couldn't get out of, they have a chance now that they didn't have yesterday. Rosalie said nothing. She didn't look like someone who needed to be told what they'd done. She looked like someone already thinking about what came next. But Wyatt watched something move across her face when Pruitt said it, something quiet and deep and satisfied in the way that only mattered things satisfied a person, and he understood that she had not spent 3 years looking for her brother because she expected a reward or a recognition. She had spent 3 years looking because he was her brother and because she could not do anything else. And the fact that it had ended up meaning something beyond the two of them was not something she'd planned and not something she'd take credit for. It was just what happened when you did the right thing long enough and hard enough and refused to stop. Pruitt left them with instructions and a promise and went to find the local sheriff, who was apparently a decent man and who needed to be brought up to speed before tomorrow morning. Wyatt and Rosalie walked back toward the boarding house through the early dark, side by side on the wooden sidewalk, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then Rosalie said, "He called you my husband." "Pruitt," Wyatt said. "Yes, you didn't correct him." Didn't seem like the moment. She was quiet for a few steps. "It was a good plan," she said. "Walking in like that. It was a very good plan," he agreed. "You didn't tell me you were going to do it. There wasn't time to explain it." "No," he said. "There wasn't." He paused. "You could have gotten hurt, so could you?" she said. "Every time you've done something in the last 4 days, you could have gotten hurt. I notice you didn't let that stop you." He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead, her chin level. The particular Rosalie Bennett carriage that he had come to understand was not stubbornness, or not only stubbornness, but the physical expression of a woman who had decided a long time ago that she was going to stand up straight in a world that kept trying to make her small. "Fair point," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something warmer than that, if anything could be warmer than a smile. They went back to Clara Midge's boarding house, and Clara had released the young man from the sitting room. "He didn't seem like a bad boy," she said. With the authority of a woman who had met enough bad men to have developed reliable calibration, and Samuel was awake and sitting at the kitchen table eating a second dinner with the focused appreciation of someone experiencing simple good things with great clarity. He looked up when they came in, took in the state of them, the dust, the urgency settling slowly out of their posture, the particular way people looked when they'd just done something difficult, and it had worked. "Well," he said. "It's done," Rosalie said. "Marshals are coming tomorrow. Pruitt has the journal. Hawthorne is going to answer for it." Samuel set down his fork. He looked at his sister, back at his sister, and then, very slowly, the expression that had been careful and controlled and measured through everything, through the escape, through the ride, through the accounting of 3 years of captivity, held together by stubbornness and love, that expression broke open into something unguarded and young and enormously, quietly relieved. His voice was rough with it. "That's good." Rosalie sat down across from him and put her hand over his on the table. And he turned his hand over and held hers, and Clara Midge appeared with 2 more cups of coffee and set them down and went back to the kitchen without a word. Because she was exactly the kind of woman who understood when a moment needed to be left alone. Wyatt stood in the doorway. He watched Samuel Bennett, 3 years of captivity, 18 months of painstaking documentation, kept alive by the belief that his sister was coming, sit it and hold his sister's hand, and look like a man who had finally, after a very long time, been allowed to put something heavy down. And he felt, standing there in that doorway, in that ordinary kitchen in that small town, something so large and so simple that he nearly had to look away from it. This was what he'd forgotten existed. Not the drama of it, not the chase. Not the evidence, not the confrontation. Those were the mechanism. This, here, the hand over the hand, the two people at the table who had found their way back to each other. This was what the mechanism was for. This was what anything was for. He set his cup down quietly and went to sit at the table with them. And Clara came back with more coffee, and the night settled around the boarding house. And somewhere outside in the dark, the Federal Telegraph line ran toward Billings, carrying a message that would change everything. And Edwin Hawthorne had one night left of believing he was untouchable. But in Clara Midge's kitchen, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was Samuel eating his dinner. What mattered was Rosalie's hand over his. What mattered was Wyatt Callahan sitting at a table with people he would not have known 3 weeks ago, feeling for the first time in 6 years entirely in the right place. The marshals arrived at first light, 3 of them. Federal, riding hard out of the gray morning with the particular authority of men who carried the law in their badges and meant every ounce of it. Harlan Pruitt met them at the edge of town and walked them to the sheriff's office. And the meeting that followed lasted 2 hours, and when it was done, the machinery of federal justice had been set into motion in a way that Edwin Hawthorne's money and connections were going to find very difficult to stop. Wyatt heard all of this from Pruitt himself, who came to Clara Midge's boarding house at 8:30 and sat at the kitchen table, and laid it out with the methodical precision of a man who had been waiting 8 months to say it. Samuel listened to every word without moving. When Pruitt finished, "Samuel," said Fenn, the deputy surveyor, "did he run?" "He tried," Pruitt said. "The sheriff picked him up last night at the edge of town with a saddlebag full of documents he was planning to destroy. He's in custody." A pause. "He's already talking." Something moved across Samuel's face, not triumph exact. Something quieter and more complicated than triumph. The expression of a man who had spent 18 months building a case in secret, in fear, in a building he was locked inside, and was now watching the first pieces of it hold exactly the way he'd built them to hold. "And Gould?" Rosalie said. "The bank?" "The marshals will be at the bank when it opens this morning," Pruitt said. "The second set of books Samuel documented will have access to them before noon." He looked at Samuel. "You did meticulous work, son. Better than most trained investigators would have done." Samuel looked at his hands on the table. "I had a lot of time," he said. Then quietly, "and I had something worth doing it for." Rosalie reached over and covered his hand with hers, the same way she had the night before, and Samuel turned his hand over and held on. Pruitt watched this and had the decency not to comment. He put his hat back on and stood. "I need Samuel at the marshal's office by 10 o'clock to begin a formal statement. The rest of you are welcome to be present." He looked at Wyatt. "You'll likely be asked to give a statement as well, regarding the situation at the assay building." "I'll be there," Wyatt said. Pruitt left, and the 3 of them sat in Clara Midge's kitchen in the quiet that followed. And Clara herself appeared from somewhere and put food on the table without being asked, because that was what Clara Midge did, and they ate. And the morning moved around them. It was Samuel who broke the silence. He looked at Wyatt over his coffee cup and said, "When this is done, when the statements are given and the marshals have what they need, what do you do?" Wyatt looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, where do you go?" Samuel said. "You've got a cabin up in the mountains. You've got your life up there. I'm asking what happens to it now." He was not being oblique. He was being exactly as direct as his sister was direct, which was completely. "Because I want to know what your intentions are toward Rosalie," Rosalie said. Samuel said, not unkindly but firmly. "I've been locked in a room for 6 months, Rosie. I've had a lot of time to think about things I'd want to say if I ever got out. This is one of them. He looked at Wyatt. She doesn't show things easily. You probably know that by now. I do, Wyatt said. But she showed you things, I can tell. The way she talks about the cabin, the way she talks about those first days. He paused. I've known my sister my entire life. I know what it looks like when she trusts someone. Because it's rare enough that you can count the instances. He held Wyatt's gaze. So I'm asking. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He looked at Rosalie, who was looking at the table with her jaw set in the particular way it set when she was managing something internal with great deliberate effort. Then he looked at Samuel. I haven't said what I need to say to her yet, Wyatt said. I'd like to do that before I answer your question. If that's all right with you. Samuel studied him for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup. Fair enough, he said. And drank. The marshal's office was crowded and efficient, and the formal statement took most of the morning. Samuel went through the journal page by page with one of the marshals, a steady, experienced man named Garrett, who asked precise questions and wrote the answers in a hand that looked like it had done this 10,000 times, and Rosalie sat beside her brother the entire time. Not speaking, just present, the way she'd been present on the road. Which was completely and without reservation. Wyatt gave his own statement in a separate room with the second marshal, a younger man who listened carefully and asked follow-up questions that told Wyatt he understood the situation better than he let on. When Wyatt finished, the marshal said, Bolden, he's coming in behind you. That's what the young man said. He arrived an hour ago, the marshal said. We have him. Wyatt looked at him. He rode into town and went directly to the land office, the marshal said. We were already there. He didn't have much to say at first. A pause. He has more to say now. Wyatt thought about Bolden in the assay building. The smooth voice and the flat eyes and the deliberate, practiced way he'd moved toward the fight. He thought about what Mace had said, he enjoys his work. He thought about Samuel's careful movements, the injuries that hadn't healed right. The way Samuel held himself with the protective instinct of a man who had learned that unexpected movement sometimes cost him. Good, Wyatt said. And he meant it in a way that was not satisfying or triumphant, but simply correct. The way a door closing on something that needed to be closed was correct. By early afternoon, the full weight of the federal investigation had descended on Garrity, with the irreversible momentum of something that had been a long time building. Word moved through the town the way word always moved through small towns, fast and with embellishment, and by the time Wyatt and Rosalie walked out of the marshal's office, people on the street knew that Edwin Hawthorne's operation was finished, and that the men responsible were in custody, and that 3 years of systematic fraud against working men had finally come apart. They stood outside on the wooden sidewalk in the thin winter sunlight. And for the first time in 4 days, there was nothing immediately required of either of them. The absence of urgency was strange. Wyatt felt it like a physical thing, the sudden stillness after sustained motion. The way your body kept bracing for the next thing, even when the next thing wasn't coming. Rosalie stood beside him and tilted her face up toward the sun. Just for a moment, with her eyes closed. A person taking a breath that they'd been waiting a long time to take. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him. What happens now, she said. Samuel needs a few more days here, Wyatt said. There'll be more questions as the investigation unfolds. Pruitt will want him available. I know that. She looked at him steadily. I meant what happens with you. He held her gaze. I need to say something to you, all right. He looked down the street for a moment, finding the words in the order they needed to be in. The way he found things in difficult terrain carefully, without forcing the path. Then he looked back at her. When I put that 20 on the counter in Raven Creek, he said, I told myself it was because I couldn't walk away and watch something wrong happen. And that was true. But it wasn't all of it. He paused. The truth is, I didn't know what all of it was. I've been 6 years on that mountain specifically because I didn't want to know things about myself anymore. Knowing things about yourself means feeling them, and feeling things was... He stopped. It was easier not to. Rosalie waited. She had the extraordinary patience of someone who understood that certain things could not be rushed. "You didn't let me not know," he said. "That first morning, when you got up before me and made the coffee and fixed the hinge and told me about my horse's foot. Every day after that, you were there, present. Real. In a way that I couldn't look away from." He held her eyes. "And somewhere between that cabin and this street, I stopped being a man who was hiding from the world and became something else. I don't know yet exactly what, but I know it started with you." Rosalie was very still. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I know your life has been people assuming things were owed to them because of what they gave or did. I'm not doing that. I'm just telling you the truth, because you've given me nothing but the truth since the night we met. And you deserve the same." He looked at her. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known, Rosalie Bennett, and I would like very much to keep knowing you. However that looks, whatever you want it to be." The street moved around them, a wagon passing. Someone calling to someone else down the block. The ordinary sounds of a town, conducting its ordinary business entirely unaware that something important was happening on this particular stretch of sidewalk. Rosalie looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was not unreadable. Wyatt had learned to read it. Over the days and the fire and the road, the way you learn to read terrain that initially seemed featureless and then revealed itself to be full of information once you knew where to look. What he saw was a woman who had spent so long being told she was not worth choosing that the experience of being chosen, clearly and without condition, was something her whole system needed a moment to process. Then she said, "You know what the hardest part was? Of these last 3 years? Tell me, not the traveling. Not the working for people who looked at me the way they looked at me. Not even losing track of Samuel, though God knows that was..." She stopped. Took a breath. "The hardest part was believing I deserved to find him. Believing that what I wanted mattered enough to keep going after it." Her voice was even. But it had something in it, a particular honesty that cost something to speak. "Every place I went, every person who looked at me like I was too much or not enough. I had to fight for that belief all over again, every single time." "I know," he said. "You don't look at me like that," she said. "You never have." "Not once." She met his eyes directly. "Do you know how rare that is?" "I'm beginning to understand it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not the same woman who came into that saloon. I don't know exactly who I am right now, on the other side of all of this. I think I need some time to find out." "That's fair," he said. "But I know I don't want to find out alone," she said. "And I know that when I think about where I want to be while I'm figuring it out..." She stopped. And for the first time since he'd known her, Rosalie Bennett looked slightly undone. Not broken, nothing so far from who she was, but undone, in the way that people looked when something they'd been careful about got too real to stay careful with. "It's that cabin," she said. "Wyatt. It's that ridiculous mountain and that drafty cabin, and the horse that has a stone bruise and the fire that takes too long to get going in the morning." She looked at him, and her eyes were bright. "That's where I want to be." He took a step toward her. She didn't move back. "Then that's where you'll be," he said. And Rosalie Bennett, who had survived 15 years of being underestimated, and 3 years of searching, and 4 days of running, and the accumulated weight of every person who had ever looked at her and seen nothing worth keeping, Rosalie Bennett put her hand against Wyatt Callahan's chest, right over the place where his heartbeat was, and left it there. He covered her hand with his, the same way she'd covered Samuel's hand the night before. The same gesture, the same meaning. "I am here. I am not leaving. You are not alone." They stood like that on the street in the thin winter sunlight for a moment that neither of them counted. Then Samuel's voice came from behind them. "I'm gonna need someone to help me figure out what comes next." They turned. He was standing in the doorway of the marshal's office. Leaning against the frame, looking at the two of them with the expression of a man who had just confirmed something he'd suspected. "What do you mean?" Rosalie said. "I mean, Pruitt thinks the federal case will result in those land parcels being returned to the workers," Samuel said. "Properly. Legally. The men at Silver Ridge who were defrauded, some of them have been there for years. They're going to need someone who understands land and building, and how to make something that was broken start working again." He looked at Wyatt. "You built a cabin in the Bitterroots by yourself. You know how things are put together." "I do," Wyatt said carefully. "And Rosalie knows people," Samuel continued. "She walked into a room full of men who had no reason to trust a stranger and had them talking within 2 hours. She could paused. There's going to be a lot of work to do. At Silver Ridge, and not just there. Hawthorne's scheme ran further than just that one camp. There are other workers in other places who don't know yet that what happened to them was illegal." Wyatt looked at Rosalie. She was already looking at him. He thought about the mountain, the cabin, the 6 years of silence he had built around himself like a wall and called it peace and known. In the honest part of himself he rarely visited, that it was something else. He thought about what it had taken to come down from that mountain a crumpled 20 bill and a woman's eyes in a saloon that told him, without a word, that the world was still capable of needing something from him. He thought about the feeling he'd had in Pruitt's office. The feeling of being in the right place. "The cabin's not going anywhere," said. Rosalie looked at him. "It'll be there," he said. "When we need it." Something shifted in her face, the last careful guard she'd been keeping. The final reserve of a woman who had trained herself not to expect things so thoroughly that the arrival of things felt dangerous. It shifted, and what was underneath it was something unguarded and luminous and entirely. "Completely need it," she said. He said. And he meant it the same way he'd meant it the first time, completely. And without reservation. 3 weeks later, Mays Dillon testified before the Federal Circuit Court in Billings. And 4 other Silver Ridge workers testified beside him. And the picture they assembled together with Samuel's journal and the bank's second set of books and Artis Fenn's increasingly desperate cooperation was so complete and so detailed that Edwin Hawthorne's attorney asked for a recess after the first hour and didn't come back looking nearly as confident as he'd gone in. Creed Bolden, facing charges that carried considerably more weight than his employer's, negotiated a cooperation agreement that filled in the gaps Samuel's documentation hadn't reached. The Territorial Savings and Loan froze Hawthorne's accounts the following morning. The fraudulent land deeds were formally voided by federal order 2 weeks after that. The men who had worked Silver Ridge under the scheme, who had believed they were earning their way toward something, and had been lied to systematically for years, those men received formal notice that the land parcels they'd been promised were, by federal decree, actually theirs, not a company deed, not a contract designed to keep them indebted, a real deed, legal in their names. Mays sent word through Pruitt. He said when the notices went out, grown men cried. He said he wasn't ashamed to admit he was one of them. Rosalie read that letter sitting at the table in Clara Midge's kitchen, where they'd stayed while Samuel finished his testimony, and the legal machinery ran its course. And when she finished reading, she folded it carefully and held it for a moment and didn't say anything. Samuel watched her from across the table. "You all right?" he said. "I'm better than all right," she said. Her voice was rough with something she wasn't going to call by its name in public. I'm thinking about those men. The ones who got the notices." She looked at the folded letter. "Nobody looked for them. Nobody came. They just got a piece of paper that said, 'You are not nothing. What happened to you was wrong. And the law says so, and here is something real.'" Samuel nodded slowly. "That matters," she said. "Even when no one comes to find you. Even when you have to wait years. The truth eventually it matters." "It does," Samuel said. "You taught me that." He paused. "Somewhere around year 2. When I was starting to lose the thread of it, I would think about you. About the fact that you never stopped. That kept me building the case when I wanted to stop building it. Rosalie looked at her brother. The brother she had carried in her pocket for 3 years in the form of a small carved bird. The brother who had kept making birds because he needed to believe she was still coming. "I was always coming," she said. "I know," he said. I knew. Wyatt came in from outside, where he'd been talking with Pruitt about the timeline for the remaining proceedings. And he stopped in the doorway the way he sometimes stopped taking in the room. The people in it, the specific quality of the moment, and Rosalie looked up and met his eyes across the kitchen. She smiled at him. Not the almost smile. Not the controlled, careful expression she'd worn in that saloon when she'd decided the world was going to be exactly as terrible as she'd always known. A real smile, full and unguarded, the smile of a woman who had stopped bracing for the world to take things away from her. Wyatt Callahan, who had spent 6 years learning how to want nothing, felt the full weight of wanting everything and was not afraid of it. He came into the kitchen and sat at the table and accepted the cup of coffee Clara Midge materialized from somewhere and set in front of him. And the three of them sat together in the warmth of that ordinary kitchen on an ordinary morning. And outside the law was doing what the law was built to do. And somewhere up in the Bitterroot Mountains, a cabin was waiting with its fire and its draft wassail and its one good horse and the life that could be built there if a person decided to build it. Spring came to Montana Territory the way it always came, not gently. Not with any particular announcement, but with the slow insistence of something that had always been going to happen and was finally getting around to it. The snow in the high country softened and pulled back from the rock faces. The creek that ran below Wyatt's cabin ran fast and cold and full. The horse, recovered fully from his stone bruise, moved without favor through the new mud of the yard. Rosalie stood on the porch in the early morning light with a cup of coffee in both hands, watching the mountains lose the last of their winter. And Wyatt came and stood beside her. She had been back on this mountain for 6 weeks. Samuel was in Garrity, working with Pruitt's office on the ongoing case, living in a proper room in a proper boarding house for the first time in 3 years. Putting himself back together with the same methodical care he'd built his piece by piece, without rushing, with the confidence of a man who understood that some things took the time they took. He wrote to Rosalie twice a week. She wrote back every time. She had been putting the cabin back together in the way she put everything practically, without ceremony, finding what needed doing and doing it, and in the process making the space into something it had never quite been before. There was a garden plot she'd started on the south side of the cabin, marked out with sticks and string against the still cold ground, waiting for the right moment. There were curtains on the windows, simple cotton. Nothing elaborate, but they changed the quality of light inside in a way that Wyatt had not expected, and found he liked very much. There was a second chair on the porch. He had not asked her to do any of these things. She had not announced any of them. She had simply, in the particular Rosalie Bennett way, seen what was needed and provided it. He stood beside her now on that porch with his own cup of coffee, looking at the mountains going green again, and after a while she said, "Samuel wants to come up in the summer. When things settle down, he's welcome," Wyatt said. "He said he wants to see the place that kept me sane for 2 weeks while the world figured itself out." She smiled. "I think he wants to inspect you at closer range. He already inspected me at fairly close range in Garrity. Samuel inspects people the way I inspect horses," she said. "Thoroughly and more than once." She paused. "He approves of you." "In case you were wondering." "I wasn't wondering," Wyatt said. She looked at him sideways. "No? I figured if he didn't approve, I'd hear about it." She laughed. Not the brief, controlled sound she'd sometimes allowed herself in those early days. A real laugh, full and easy, the laugh of a woman who had decided that joy was something she was allowed to take up space with. Wyatt listened to that laugh and thought, not for the first time, that it was one of the finest sounds he had ever heard. After a while she said, "I've been thinking about what Samuel said." in Garrity, about the other workers, the other camps. She held her cup in both hands. There are people out there still in the same situation. Not just Hawthorne's workers. Men who've been defrauded. Families who've lost things they should never have lost. Pruitt's investigation opened the door, but doors don't do much good if nobody walks through them. No, Wyatt agreed. They don't. I want to walk through it, she said. I want to help figure out who else needs what Samuel needed, someone who comes. Someone who doesn't stop, someone who puts the evidence in front of the people who can do something with it. She looked at him. I know that's not a simple thing. I know it means moving. Sometimes, not staying in one place. I've been in one place for 6 years, Wyatt said. She looked at him steadily. I think I've rested long enough, he said. Something moved across her face, bright and certain, and absolutely characteristic of her. This mountain will still be here, she said, when we need it. She was giving his words back to him. He recognized them, and he recognized the thing behind them, the absolute trust that a home was not a place you had to stay in to keep. That it would hold, that it would wait, that you could go out into the world and do the work the world needed, and come back and it would still be yours. He had not known that for a very long time. He knew it now. Yes, he said. It will. She leaned into him slightly, not leaning on him. Nothing so passive as that. Just a deliberate, quiet closing of the distance between them. A choice made consciously and without apology. He put his arm around her shoulders and she let him. And they stood on the porch together, looking at the mountains coming alive again after the long cold. 2 carved birds sat on the windowsill inside the cabin, Samuel's first one and the second. The twin, side by side in the morning light. The birds that had traveled between a brother and a sister through 3 years of separation and fear and refusal to give up. They sat there simply, as objects sat, but they carried the full weight of everything that had brought 3 people to this mountain and everything that would carry them forward from it. Wyatt Callahan had paid 20 for a woman the world had decided was worth nothing. What the world had failed to understand, what the men in that saloon, and Caleb Mercer, and every person who had ever looked at Rosalie Bennett and seen too much or not enough had failed to understand, was that worth was never something the world assigned. Worth was something a person carried in the way they showed up, in the way they kept going, in the way they looked at the people around them and saw them clearly and refused to look away. Rosalie had known her worth the whole time. She had simply been waiting for a world that would confirm it. And Wyatt Callahan, who had climbed a mountain 6 years ago to hide from everything he had loved and lost, had come down from it for 20 and a pair of eyes that looked at the world without flinching, and had found something he had not known he was still capable of finding. A reason, a family, a home that moved with him wherever he went. Because home was not the cabin and it was not the mountain. Home was the woman standing beside him on the porch in the spring morning light, deciding what the next right thing was and getting ready to go do it. The mountain man who had spent 6 years running from life had found his way back to the middle of it. And he was never, not for a single day, going to waste it again.